At night, my son pretended to be my husband, and he pulled it off a real infidelity story. I had no idea what would happen that evening. It ended up being one of the wildest yet most thrilling evenings of my life, as I felt my son rather than my spouse. It began like any other peaceful evening in our house. After supper, everything was quiet, the dishwasher was running in the kitchen, and there was a slight creak as the house went to sleep. I had no idea how much this night would alter my life, my family, and even who I was. My name is Amanda, and I believed I had everything all out until lately. I am a 42-year-old woman who has worked hard to establish a respectable life for herself. Despite our marriage's ups and downs, I have always thought my husband Charles and I were a good match. We have been married for 18 years. Our 2 children are my 19-year-old son David, who continues to live at home while attending college, and my daughter Carrera, who is currently enrolled in college, community college. David has never talked much as a child, because David preferred to stay in his room and read or work on whatever new project had caught his attention throughout the years, while Sierra was all fire and energy. Charles and I used to joke that he was the calm to Sierra's storm. He usually smiled and assured me he was well whenever I asked, but occasionally I worried he might feel a little overshadowed by his sister or even by Charles and me. However, I saw some slight changes in him as he grew older. His typically modest smiles changed to flitting glances, and he appeared more reserved. Sometimes I would find him staring at me with something in his eyes that I couldn't quite place. Something inquisitive, even probing. I never really thought about it and just chalked it up to awkwardness in adolescence. Charles had spent a few days away from home on one of his regular business travels. He put in a lot of work and frequently went for planning meetings and conferences. There was nothing unusual about it. There was nothing unusual, and I was used to taking care of things while she was away. There was just David and me in the house because Sierra was occupied with her studies. David was quieter than normal the first night after Charles left. During our supper together, I made an effort to strike up a discussion by inquiring about his schoolwork and his most recent endeavor, a 3D model that he had been printing for weeks. He gave me a kind but brief response, his eyes flashing to mine before continuing. It was a little strange at first, but I had become accustomed to it. There was just David and me in the house because Sierra was occupied with her studies. David was quieter than normal the first night after Charles left. During our supper together, I made an effort to strike up a discussion by inquiring about his schoolwork and his most recent endeavor, a 3D model that he had been printing for weeks. He gave a courteous response but with few words. His gaze flicked to mine and back again as if he was worried about something. "Are you okay, buddy?" With a frown I asked. "You haven't said much this evening." He smiled slightly at me, but it was not visible. "Yes, I'm alright, I'm just worn out." I suppose I didn't insist. David had been all along, or reticent, and I assumed that if something was truly bothering him, he would open up. However, I made no mention of it, so I went to bed as usual. The sight of Charles's bed that he was behaving strangely, as though he was anxious about something. "Are you all right?" With a frown I asked. He gave me a small smile, but I was unable to see it in his eyes. "I'm all right, just exhausted." I assumed he was more quiet and would open out if something was truly bothering him. I went to bed without saying anything, though it felt more empty than ever at Charles's side of the bed. And I missed him, the warmth of his body beside mine, and the quiet sound of his voice as he fell asleep. I closed my eyes, turned off the lights, and allowed the house's soothing sounds lull me to sleep. I was awakened by the slightest squeak of the bedroom door opening at some point during the night, with a skip in my heartbeat. I looked into the darkness. Apart from that, the room was quiet. I became acutely aware of how much I missed Charles and felt incredibly empty. I could visualize his cozy body next me, and I genuinely missed his voice as he drifted away. To go to sleep, I let the typical sounds of the house lull me to sleep after turning off the lights and closing my eyes. Then, somewhere in the middle of the night, I heard the bedroom groan just a little bit. Door opening. I narrowed my eyes and felt my heart skip a beat. The only sounds in the room were my own breathing and the slight rustle of fabric as someone approached. My voice was husky with sleep as I muttered. Initially, I believed that she had arrived home early, perhaps to my surprise. The figure remained silent instead, as the person sat on the edge of the bed, The mattress sunk a little. My dazed brain attempted to comprehend what was going on, but before I could fully awaken, I sensed a kind hand resting on my leg. That's what it was. I felt someone's touch on my calf as I opened my mouth to speak. Charles's hand was stroking me in a familiar manner, as if he were attempting to soothe me. However, something seemed a little strange, as though the hand was a little reluctant. Whoever it was appeared to be attempting, though they weren't really sure how, to mimic Charles's movements. My vision adjusted to the pale glimmer of the moonlight coming through the blinds when I opened my eyes. My heart stopped when I saw that. It was David, not Charles, who was seated beside me. David. I expressed my confusion and anxiety. What are you up to? I asked, but he remained with his hand on my arm without moving. Even though his eyes were closed and I could see he was hesitant, I could tell he wanted to speak. Are things going well? I asked, feeling anxious and sitting up now. His voice was almost heard as he asked, Mom, why are you here? What are you doing? I asked in a perplexed and anxious tone. He remained motionless, his hand still resting lightly on my arm. Although there was some shadowing on his face, I could still sense the anxiety in his eyes. His mouth was open as though he wanted to speak, but he didn't utter anything. Aim high. Is everything in order? I questioned, sitting up now, feeling his hands warm through my shirt's fabric, and my pulse was pounding. His voice was hardly audible above a whisper when he interrupted. Why are you here, Mom? I didn't intend to wake you up. I scowled, my perplexity only intensifying. He hesitated and looked down at the floor, dropping his hand as he asked, Why are you here? I'm not sure, he responded quietly. I just wanted to check in with you. I gazed at him. Not knowing how to respond, he was staring at me with such uncertainty and vulnerability that it made my chest clench. I answered softly, I'm fine, David. But you ought to be in bed. I apologized politely, but you ought to be in bed. It's late. After a brief silence, he gently rose up, his shoulders sagging. I apologize. I'll go, he said, turning to go. I wanted to stop him, but I wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the way he appeared so defeated or the odd sense of remorse that was churning in my stomach. However, I released him and watched as he vanished through the door. I reclined, gazing at the ceiling while my thoughts whirled. What was happening? Despite the late hour, he remained still. Then, with his shoulders slumping, he gently stood up. He turned to walk, saying, Sorry, I'll go. I had the want to stop him, but I wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the way he appeared so defeated or the peculiar sense of remorse that was churning in my stomach. However, I let him leave and watched as he vanished through the door. I reclined, gazing at the ceiling while my thoughts whirled. What was the purpose of that? Why had he entered my room in that manner? And why did it make me feel so uncomfortable? The most absurd aspect, though, was that it wasn't over yet. Oh no, the story hasn't reached its conclusion yet. I woke up earlier than normal the following day. After David's sudden arrival, I had scarcely slept since I couldn't relax. Each time I closed my eyes, I relived the scene where he sat on the bed and the hesitancy in his voice. I was attempting to figure out why he had entered my room in that manner, and why it had made me feel so uncomfortable. However, that wasn't the most absurd aspect. There was undoubtedly more to the story. I woke up earlier than normal the following day. I had hardly slept at all following David's surprise arrival. I kept thinking about the time he sat on the bed, the pause in his voice, and the way his hand lingered on me as if he wasn't sure if he should have been there. It was unnerving, but not in the way I had anticipated. I dismissed the ideas as I prepared for the day. David was already at the table, drinking coffee and browsing through his phone when I came downstairs. When I walked in, he looked up. Although his face was unreadable, his posture had a rigidity to it that had never been there before, though not in the way I had anticipated. His voice and the way his hand lingered on me as though he wasn't sure if he should be there were a little unnerving. As I prepared for the day, I shook the thoughts aside. David was already at the table, sipping coffee and browsing through his phone when I came downstairs. When I went in, he looked up, his face blank, but his posture had a rigidity to it that had never been there before. Good morning, I murmured, attempting to seem light. You wake up early. Indeed, he said in a low voice. I had a hard time falling asleep. After a brief moment of hesitation, I poured myself a cup of coffee and took a seat across from him. David, regarding last night, I apologize. I didn't intend to offend you in any way. I shouldn't have entered your room. It's okay, I said hastily. I was concerned that you appeared upset. Good morning, I said, attempting to sound informal. You're up early. Yes, he said in a low voice. He had a hard time falling asleep. After a brief moment of hesitation, I poured myself a cup of coffee and took a seat across from him. David, regarding last night, I apologize. His voice was sharper than I had anticipated when he interrupted. I didn't intend to frighten you in any way. I shouldn't have entered your room. It's okay, I said hastily. I was concerned that you appeared upset. With a shrug, he returned his attention to his phone. I couldn't forget about it, but it's nothing, so forget about it. The way he caressed my arm and the way he had gazed at me. It was too intentional and significant to be dismissed as unimportant. It had exhilarated me somehow. I couldn't quite identify it. And what was most bizarre was that I also sensed something from his side. I wanted to find out what was going on inside by asking him more questions. He turned back to his phone, but I couldn't help but remember how he had caressed my arm and stared at me. It was too intentional and significant to be dismissed as unimportant. It had, in a sense, exhilarated me. I couldn't exactly put my finger on it, and the most bizarre thing was that I also sensed something from his side, that I wanted to ask him more questions to find out what was going through his mind, but his body language told me to leave it alone for the time being. For that instant I did. The remainder of the day went without incident. David spent the majority of it in his room, and I kept myself occupied with housework and errands in an effort to dispel any residual anxiety. When nightfall finally arrived, I was worn out and prepared to pass out. I tried to keep my thoughts from returning to the previous night as I crawled beneath the blankets, but they wouldn't go away. I suspected something was wrong with David, but I was unable to identify it. I was attempting to ignore the strange behavior he was displaying. However, I couldn't get it out of my head. I was working on some chores when I became quite exhausted and wanted to retire to bed. Despite my best efforts, I was unable to ignore it. What had taken place? Was there something he was trying to conceal from me? Or was there another event taking place? I'm not sure, but I won't acknowledge it. I believe I fell asleep for a little while since I heard the door open when I woke up. I sat up, gazing into the darkness as my heart sprang at the sound. I heard a voice, but I couldn't identify the speaker. I stopped wondering what had caused David to enter my room in that manner. Was there something more he wasn't telling me about? Or was he coping with something else? I didn't want to acknowledge it. I must have fallen asleep at some time, because I woke up to the sound of the door creaking open once more. The next thing I knew, I sat up, staring into the darkness as my heart leaped. I whispered, "Charles?" even though I knew it wasn't her. The moonlight showed David's well-known form as the person paused in the doorway before entering. Confusion with something else caused my heart rate to increase. I believed that the same scenario was replaying itself in my head. Maybe I thought I was dreaming. "David," I said with a hint of worry and annoyance in my voice. "What's happening? Why have you returned?" He took a while to respond. Rather, he approached the bed and took a seat on the edge. He came to a halt in the doorway and entered. In the moonlight, David's well-known body was visible. I felt perplexed and my pulse sped up, but I couldn't pinpoint the cause. I felt as though I was mentally experiencing the same scenario. I believed I was having a dream. David might have done it. I spoke in a tone that was a mix of worry and annoyance. "What's happening? Why have you returned?" He took a while to respond. Rather, he moved toward the bed and took a seat on the edge. He was dressed in sweatpants and a loose t-shirt, much like the previous evening. There was a vulnerability in his stance and his hair was disheveled from sleep, which made me feel something. He replied softly, "I'm sorry," while keeping his eyes on the ground. I realized this is strange. I simply didn't want to be alone myself. "Why?" I asked in a softer tone. "David, what's going on?" "You are welcome to speak with me." He hesitated, twitching the hem with his fingertips. His hair was all messed up from sleep. He was wearing sweatpants and a loose t-shirt once more. And he had this expression on his face that truly got to me. He looked down and muttered, "I'm sorry. I realize this is strange, but I simply do not want to be alone." "Why?" I asked in a slightly gentler tone. David, what's going on? You are welcome to speak with me. He hesitated, his fingers twitching at the edge of his shirt. I'm not sure, he acknowledged. Simply said. The house feels so empty, Sierra isn't here, and Mom is gone that I suppose all I wanted was to feel intimate with someone. His remark struck me more strongly than I had anticipated. In Charles's absence, I had been so preoccupied with my own loneliness that I hadn't considered how David could be feeling. He added that he had always been quiet and reserved, but perhaps it was his way of saying, I don't know about his shirt. Sierra's not here, Mom is gone, and the home feels so vacant. I suppose all I wanted was to feel intimate with someone. I wasn't prepared for how hard his remarks affected me. In Charles's absence, I had been so preoccupied with my own loneliness that I hadn't considered how it could be impacting David. By yourself. I'm present. His eyes scanned mine after he glanced up at me, and for a brief instant, there was a charge in the air between us that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I tried to defuse the tension by smiling and giving him a shoulder squeeze. Come on, I patted the bed. You can stay here for a while if that helps, but you must not. I patted the bed as I said. If you would like to stay here for a while, you must make a commitment to actually sleeping, okay? Didn't know why I said that, but I somehow had the feeling that I didn't want to sleep again. His apprehensive expression vanished as he grinned and nodded. David said, Okay, thanks, Mom, while lying down on the opposite side of the bed and maintaining a respectable distance. He closed his eyes and switched off the light, attempting to block out the odd jumble of feelings he was experiencing. Except for the sound of our breathing, the room was quiet and I could hear it. I didn't know why, but I said I would sleep. I also had the feeling that I didn't want to sleep again. He eased the strain in his face by nodding and grinning a little. That I'm grateful, Mom, David added. He lay down with a reasonable distance on the opposite side of the bed. He switched off the light and tried to ignore the strange jumble of emotions churning inside of me by closing my eyes. Except for the sound of our breathing, the room was quiet, and I could sense his presence next to me like a steady warm pulse. I eventually fell asleep, although it was a restless one. I awoke once more in the midst of my senses are on high alert at night. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me up, but then I sensed a gentle, tentative touch on my arm. David, I muttered. My voice sounded sluggish. His hand hovered, brushing, but he didn't respond. Softly against my flesh. It was a very thoughtful and gentle gesture that moved me. I sensed his presence beside me, like steady warm pulse. That I dozed off at one point, but it was a restless sleep. My senses were on high alert when I woke up again in the middle of the night. I had no idea what had woke me up initially, but then I sensed a gentle, tentative touch on my arm. That I whispered, David. My voice is still slurred. His touch remained, lightly grazing my flesh. But he didn't respond. The move was so delicate and intentional that it made my breath catch in my throat, although my body wouldn't move. My thoughts begged me to say anything to halt this before it became any worse. He whispered, Mom, in a scarcely discernible voice. That I apologize. I looked at him as I turned my head. My chest was thumping with my heartbeat. His expression was inches from me, and I couldn't help but see the mixture of dread and yearning in his eyes. He leaned forward and placed his lips across my cheek before I could respond. My respiration became quite rapid, and I thought I was having trouble breathing. I wanted to stop talking, but I was immobile. Mom, he whispered softly. I apologize. I stared at him while my heart pounded loudly. His face was quite near to mine, and I couldn't help but see the mixture of fear and want in Dee's eyes. His lips then stroked my cheek as he drew nearer. I was completely taken aback by how swift and delicate it was. What are you doing? With a slightly trembling voice, but not in a fearful manner, I asked. His voice broke as he said, I don't know. I'm not sure. There was a lot of tension in the room. It felt like a tight wire between us to remain silent. I was frozen. Yet I wanted to say something to break the spell. My mind was racing, but I was unable to make sense of it. David appeared to be experiencing desperation and embarrassment as he stepped back a little. The gesture's swiftness and gentleness astounded me. What are you doing? With a shaky voice but not a fearful one, I questioned. I'm not sure, he acknowledged. His voice broke at I simply. I'm not sure. There was tension in the room, and the quiet between us was like a taut wire. I was frozen when I wanted to say something to break the spell, and my mind was running too quickly to make sense. David drew back a little, a look of desperation and shame on his face. I apologized. I ought not to have done that. I'll leave before I can reply. I was left alone with the terrible weight of what had just transpired when he vanished into the darkness. I believe he was unaware that I was okay with it. To be honest, I was happy that he went. At this point, I was certain that I wanted more. Even though I had never seen this before, I made the decision to invite him to sleep and attempt to ignore it for the time being. I asked him to spend the night with me tomorrow, after which we might talk about it. The following day, I was unable to concentrate on anything. My mind kept returning to David, his tentative touch, his muttered apologies, and the way his lips had barely touched my cheek. David avoided me all morning because I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was all too much and too bizarre. He kept the door to his room locked, and I lacked the guts to knock. He most likely required, I informed myself. When I saw him again the following day, we spoke. About last night, he said. I was unable to concentrate on anything. My mind kept returning to David, his tentative touch, his muttered apologies, and the way his lips had hardly touched my cheek. I kept thinking about it even though it was all too much and too weird. David stayed away from me all morning. He kept the door to his room locked, and I lacked the guts to knock. He most likely needed time to digest what had happened, I told myself, and to be honest, I did too. However, the atmosphere in the house grew intolerable as the hours passed. By the middle of the afternoon, I was at my breaking point. I discovered that I was standing outside his door with my hand millimeters from the wood. I thought about leaving for a second, but then I knocked gently. David, can we have a conversation? I made an effort to speak steadily. After a protracted silence, I finally heard his footsteps getting closer. He appeared different when he opened the door. I had time to think about what had occurred, and he did as well. However, the atmosphere in the house grew intolerable as the hours passed. But then I knocked gently. David, I murmured, attempting to maintain a steady tone. Can we have a conversation? After a protracted silence, I finally heard his footsteps coming. He appeared different when he opened the door. Something gentler, almost vulnerable, took the place of his often guarded countenance, and it gave me a chest ache. Hey! He whispered softly as he moved aside to make room for me. After entering his room, I stopped to look around. Like him, it was tidy and well organized, yet there was a lingering sense of hesitancy. I obeyed his motion for me to sit on the bed even though my nerves were screaming for me to get out. All I wanted to do was check in. You mean last night? After a time, I said. He hunched slightly and winced his shoulders. I apologize, he responded hastily. It was strange, I admit. I ought not to have. I interrupted by raising a hand. It's all right. I'm not angry. All I have to do is comprehend what is happening, and I have something to share with you. His hands were twitching in his lap as he paused. I'm not sure, he eventually acknowledged. Sometimes I just feel so alone, and when Mom isn't around, it's like He hunched his shoulders and winced, then quickly apologized. I realize it was strange, he added hastily. I ought not to have done that. I held up a hand to interrupt. It's all right. I'm not angry. All I have to do is comprehend what is happening, and I have something to share with you. His hands were twitching in his lap as he paused. I'm not sure, he eventually acknowledged. I suppose it's just that sometimes I feel so alone, and even with you here, the home seems lonely while Mom is gone. But listening to it hurt to hear him express that he felt alone. I murmured softly. I apologize if I've caused you to feel that way, David. Don't worry, you're not alone. I'm always here for you. He gave a nod, but his eyes remained on the floor. He remarked. I know it's just not the same. What are you saying? I asked, bending a little forward. He inhaled deeply, and his hands, tightening into fists. It's difficult to explain, he continued, scarcely raising his voice above a whisper. It seems as though I want to be near you, but not in the manner that is expected of me, and I am unsure of how to proceed. His words lingered in the air, harsh and heavy, and I felt my stomach turn over in knots. Was unsure on how to react. I wanted to brush and part. I wanted to reassure him that it was only a phase, but I also felt an odd pull toward him. I started cautiously, David. I believe you're perplexed. It's acceptable to feel. He interrupted me with a strong, I'm not confused. After his eyes locked with mine, there was a silence. Intensity that caused my heart to race. I am aware that my feelings are abnormal. I can't help it, though. I opened. I attempted to speak, but I was unable. We sat there in silence instead. I thought I was going to blow up with what I was experiencing for him. And I wanted to reassure him that everything would be all right, but I wasn't sure how. I hadn't expressed my feelings to him yet, but things were going to get insane. I made an effort to pretend that nothing was wrong, and that we were just friends that evening. We ate dinner together, and spoke everyday topics such as work and school, but there was an unsaid conflict between us that neither of us mentioned. I could sense his gaze on me at all times. My skin pricked with a mixture of uneasiness and an unidentified feeling when I turned away. I wanted to invite him to spend the night, but I was unable to do so. When I eventually made it to, nevertheless, I couldn't get rid of the impression that, even though we had dinner and talked about everyday topics like work and school, there was an unsaid tension between us that neither of us expressed anything related. Every time I turned my head away, I could feel his eyes on me, and it made my skin tingle with a mixture of uneasiness and an unidentified feeling. When I tried to invite him to spend the night with me, I simply couldn't get the words out. When I eventually went to sleep, I couldn't get rid of the sensation that the night